Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I just wanted to quickly check if everyone can hear me. So you've got a chat box. If you just type in the chat box whether you can hear me and everything is good. So yeah, if you just type in the chat whether you can hear. Great. That's the answer that I wanted. Perfect. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone who's tuned in. I think we've got people who will be joining for the next few minutes. But yeah, I think we have people from all over the world that have joined. So it would be great if you could just comment maybe where you're joining from, just so we can see the spread of people that we have around the world. That would be really nice. So yeah, do use the chat box and yeah, leave a comment. And yeah, welcome to the Psychology Behind Forensic Psychology, hosted by Professor Thomas Davis. And my name is Sophia Ali. I'm an editor at Macmillan International Higher Education. So we publish higher education textbooks for university students and instructors. And our latest publication is the wonderful Forensic Psychology Fact and Fiction by Thomas Davis. And yeah, it's just published. It's incredible. And yeah, great. Oh, we've got people commenting from people from Malaysia, people from London, Massachusetts, Sheffield, Istanbul, Glasgow. It's amazing. Naples, South Wales, repping Finland, amazing. Oh, that's great. It's a really good mix. And yeah, I hope you're all good. I hope you're all tuning in at a sensible time. But yeah, so I think we've got a good mix of instructors and students and just people who are really interested in forensic psychology like me, who have an attachment to the subject and are just really drawn to the fascination and mystique that surrounds it. That surrounds crime, media portrayals of crime as a form of escapism, and also just kind of getting to the truth and the facts and justice, which is really what Tom's book is all about. So yeah, I just want to quickly go over just the structure of this. I'm going to hand over to Tom in a second to begin his presentation. But throughout the presentation, if any of you have any questions that you would like to ask at the Q&A at the end, please submit it in the question box. And throughout the presentation, whether it be a question on something that Tom says, forensic psychology in general, or a question about the book, and yeah, we'd be happy to answer at the end. So thank you all again for attending, and I will pass over to Tom.
Great, thank you, Sophia, I appreciate it. Good day, everyone, and thank you for attending this presentation. I'm Professor Tom Davis, and let me give you just a little preview of our journey today. We'll start with a review of the common facts and fictions in this field, and then we'll examine some of the controversial, well, actually one of the most controversial cases I've seen in eyewitness misidentification. And my goal today when we get to the end is kind of show you the psychology behind the forensic psychology. And that's really the approach to the book. And one of the questions that we always seem to ask between all of us is, why are we so fascinated with this field of forensic psychology? You see shows that are so popular, Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, Criminal Minds, Wentworth, Harrow. It's safe to say that many of us are absolutely fascinated with forensic psychology, but we want to know exactly what sets a person off the track to break the law or cause violent harm to others. It's the kind of thing we really don't want to look at or see, but at the same time, we can't seem to look away. So we have to remember that forensic psych it's more than just human fascination. It's really a career for many people. And many of your students out there considering this to be your career. It really plays a significant role in the legal systems in many different countries. After all, uncovering the motivations and psychological states of suspects helps solve crimes, gain convictions, but maybe most importantly, understanding the psychological motivations behind crime is an essential step toward crime prevention. And that's really where we're going today. So there's a lot of reasons. There's three main reasons why we're so fascinated with forensic psychology. The first one, and you may not have thought about this, but crime can affect any of us, regardless of age, our gender, our ethnicity, our social status. And it seems to happen randomly. And when it does, it can devastate people's lives. Second, the inside world of crime, the work of legal counsel, court proceedings, police investigations, is rarely seen by the public. And so it is mysterious for many of us. And I believe, though, it's the third reason is our obsession with understanding the darkest side of human behavior. The study of forensic psych allows us to explore the darkest nature from a safe distance, if you will. The fear of the unknown is one of the most natural and instinctive fears that we have. It's also one of our oldest curiosities. So one of the things we thought we'd do this morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, is let's examine some of the most controversial issues in forensic psychology. This isn't a test, but I'd like you to survey your opinion about whether these 6 statements are true or false. And we're going to run a survey right now, a poll. So take a look at these 6 statements. Eyewitnesses are a reliable source of information. Why don't you go ahead and vote and decide whether you think that's true or false? Human memory works like a video camera. True or false? A person cannot have a memory of something that never actually happened. True or false? Number 4, victims of violent crime are never blamed for the crimes they suffer from. Number 5, long prison terms are probably the best way to prevent future crimes. And finally, number 6, the key component of forensic psychology is offender profiling, sometimes known as criminal profiling.
We're just going to give it a minute just for everyone to vote, and then we'll share the results. Okay, so the results are now showing. Tom, can you see that?
I can, thank you very much.
Great.
So as you look at the results, there's a lot of variability among these questions. And if you're like my students, this is some of the key areas you're interested in. And I'll tell you right now, and some of you have probably guessed, all 6 of these statements are false. Every one of them. And let me show you how that works in a true case. And what I often tell people is in the field of forensic psychology, sometimes the truth is actually more fascinating than fiction. And that's what we're going to look at right now. Let's take a look at all these statements in the context of a really intriguing and provocative case. You can see the 2 main persons in this case. This is the case of Ronald Cotton on the left and Jennifer Thompson. In the provocatively titled book, Picking Cotton, exoneree Ronald Cotton and abuse victim Jennifer Thompson Cano tell of an emotional story of misidentification and wrongful conviction in North Carolina, USA. Back in 1984, a Black man broke into Jennifer's apartment while she was asleep, and Jennifer was raped. She was a white college student. She was raped at knife point, And here's what's so strange is even as she screamed, even as her attacker shoved her down on the bed, pinned her hands behind her, the 22-year-old college student knew exactly what to do. She had the presence of mind. She told herself that she would remember everything about this night. His voice, his hair, his leering eyes. And she even knew she would trick him into turning on the light to study his features. She was looking for scars. She was looking for tattoos. She was looking for anything that would help identify him later. She offered to make her attacker a drink. And while she was doing that, she escaped out the window. Now, as Jennifer Thompson fled, she talked about making a vow that she would track down this stranger who had smashed into her life. And she even said in her book that if she couldn't kill him, she'd do the next best thing. She'd send him to prison for the rest of her life. So, unlike most people, Jennifer Thompson knew she was going to remember this person, and she tried. 3 days later at the police department, she helped compose a composite sketch. Ronald Cotton was arrested in the community shortly afterwards. Even though Jennifer Thompson was unsure that Ronald Cotton was her rapist, she spent much more than the normal amount of time looking at the photo array of all the suspects, and eventually she selected the photo of Ronald Cotton. After her choice, the investigators told Jennifer that she had done a great job. A week later, she sat across a table from 6 men holding numbered cards in a live lineup. There was no one-way mirror to shield her from these people. Each walked up and repeated the words that Jennifer heard that night: "Shut up or I'll cut you." Jennifer Thompson picked number 5, saying, "That's my rapist." And after identifying Ronald Cotton for a second time, first in the photo array and then in the live lineup, the detectives told her, "We thought that might be the guy. It's the same person that you picked from the photo lineup." In fact, the only member who had been in the previously presented photo array was Ronald Cotton. Ronald had a weak alibi and a minor criminal record and was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life plus 54 years for first-degree rape, first-degree sexual offense, and first-degree breaking and entering. But during his time in prison, after being sentenced for 54 years in prison, he was a model prisoner who continued to profess his innocence. Until one day, when he spotted a fellow prisoner who bore a strikingly strong resemblance to him. His name was Bobby Leon Poole. Ronald Cotton intuitively knew that Bobby Poole was the rapist for whom he was doing time, and as further evidence, he later got a tip from a fellow inmate that Poole had bragged about raping 2 white women. So with this alleged prison cell confession, a second trial was held with Bobby Poole present. Now, Jennifer had to testify again at this trial. And surprisingly, when Jennifer did not recognize Bobby Poole during his trial and only found Ronald Cotton familiar, it was very interesting. And I say surprisingly, because Bobby Leon Poole was in reality her real rapist. Yet, as Jennifer looked at him, there was no spark of recognition in Jennifer Thompson's memory. Only Ronald Cotton was in her memory. Now, the trial and alleged prison confession did not sway the prosecutor or judge, and Ronald Cotton was sent back to prison to serve out the rest of his 54 remaining years. Fortunately, the Innocence Project came into play. This is a global organization whose mission is to exonerate wrongfully accused. They're found throughout the world. They are located in many large cities, universities, colleges, and it's where people, students, and budding forensic psychologists donate their time to work to exonerate the wrongfully convicted. They arrived and re-examined the evidence. Fortunately, there was still a trace of DNA evidence from the crime, and they warned Ronald Cotton that this could cut both ways, that this DNA evidence could convict you as well as exonerate you. Ronald consented, and after spending over a decade in prison, the DNA test cleared him of rape and identified the real rapist of Bobby Leon Poole. Now, can you imagine how Jennifer Thompson felt? The police told Jennifer that the DNA test had proven Ronald Cotton was innocent and Bobby Leon Poole was the actual perpetrator. And of course, as anyone would be, she was shocked and overcome with feelings of guilt, but soon came to realize that eyewitness misidentifications, unfortunately, are not rare. In 1995, Ronald was exonerated and released, and in a strange twist of fate, he forgave Jennifer. And as you see in the picture there, they became good friends and now travel the world to educate the public about wrongful conviction and better reforms, especially in relationship to eyewitness identification procedures. This is a controversial case and one that illustrates very well some of the myths, facts, and fictions of this field of forensic psychology. Let's take a look now and just look at these 6 myths that I had you identify earlier. All of them were fictions and how they relate to this story. Myth number 1 was eyewitnesses are reliable sources of information. Now, you may not know this, but most juries consider eyewitness accounts the second most persuasive piece of evidence to prove guilt. What's the first? What's more persuasive than an eyewitness is actually a signed confession. Eyewitness evidence is powerful, as you can imagine. Judges, juries, the public, we believe that the way we remember an event must actually be the way it really happened. A lot of mistaken eyewitness identifications, at least in the United States, contribute to approximately 69% of wrongful convictions. These are convictions that were overturned with DNA evidence. So, I mean, besides the moral injustice of false confessions, inaccurate eyewitnesses can mislead the initial stage of the police investigation. They waste valuable time for police following false leads. And because of this inaccurate information, the real offender may actually remain free to commit more crimes. So the question you might think is, how could Jennifer make this mistake? Well, one of the problems was, after Jennifer identified Ronald Cotton in the photo array by photograph, her level of confidence was manipulated by the detectives. And I'm not saying it was intentional, but they congratulated her on selecting the same person they thought was the offender, and it actually reinforced her choice. And through a process in psychology we call hindsight bias, then she believed that she knew that Ronald Cotton was the real rapist all along. And although witnesses can be very confident in their memory is accurate when identifying a suspect, memory is changeable. And it makes eyewitness testimony one of the most unreliable forms of evidence. In fact, we now know there is almost no correlation between confidence and accuracy. You can have extremely confident witnesses that are extremely inaccurate. So information from before and after the crime actually altered Jennifer's memory. And Jennifer's choice of Ronald Cotton from the photo array was reinforced, of course. And she didn't remember that the first time she actually saw Ronald Cotton was in the photo array, not the night of the attack. And then she believed that her ability to identify him and recognize him during the physical lineup, she thought that that was because she had seen him during the night of the attack, not from the photo array, which it actually was. So we call this a source monitoring error, and it's a really interesting phenomenon. We all make this mistake because remembering information is more important than remembering where it came from or what its source was. So that was one of the first mistakes that they made in this trial. Another myth that is related to this is the idea that most people believe that human memory works like a video camera. And after all, why shouldn't? One of the issues that we look at with Jennifer is the amount of time that it took her to recognize Ronald Cotton's photo from the photo array indicates that there was a problem with her memory. In fact, recognition memory, especially of faces, is very, very fast. In fact, whole sections of our cortex are dedicated to recognizing faces. So if she spent more than 10 seconds on the photo array, she actually spent a good 5 to 10 minutes. It should have been a warning sign that she wasn't recognizing a face, but she was creating a memory based on the best fit of her recall. Now, for those of you that aren't aware of it, our facial recognition ability is truly amazing. It's actually one of our superpowers, if you will. Imagine that instead of identifying faces, we are identifying apples. So you're stopped in traffic and a truck full of apples on the way to the store is parked next to you, and you look over and see the apples, but a week later you're picking out produce and you recognize some of those same apples that you saw in the back of the truck. In a similar way, our ability to identify faces is developed very early on, and it's really, really fast. So at this point, I'm going to tell you something about Jennifer's memory and all our memories that you may not believe, and you may not even want to believe. There's no such thing as a real memory. All of our memories are acts of creative reconstruction and imagination. New research shows that this is really the way that memory tends to work, especially autobiographical or episodic memory. Let me explain. We know that memory is a physical thing. It's not just an idea, it's a physical trace left in your brain. A trace made largely of proteins connecting one brain cell to another. But the act of remembering on a literal level is an act of creation. You may not know this, but every memory that you have, every time you remember it, you're reconstructing it, brand new. And it's not just an act of creation, but it's an act of imagination. Every time you remember something, you're changing the memory just a little bit. Believe it or not, we're always changing our memories slightly. You think you're remembering something that took place 30 years ago. Actually, you're remembering that memory reinterpreted in the light of today, in the light of now. And so does this mean there's no such thing as a memory for all time that hides somewhere in a secret vault somewhere? Well, no. All you've really got is the most recent recollection of the experience. The key thing is, how do we know that any memory we have is verifiably true? And the answer to that, sadly, is you don't. And that's one of the great ironies of memory research. The more you remember something, the less accurate it becomes. The more it becomes about you and the less it becomes about what happened. So imagine, if you will, let's imagine a couple in love. And it's their first kiss. And it's a memorable, passionate embrace. And as they go through the rest of their relationship in the next 36 years together, the kiss will gradually be replaced by two independently reimagined and increasingly different kisses, assuming that they think about that kiss enough. That's what the theory implies. But you're thinking certainly that there's got to be some true kiss, or that is that kiss just gone? Unfortunately, that true kiss vanished the minute their lips parted. Their memories of the kiss just grow slowly farther and farther apart. If this was during a class I teach, I'd cue up the really sad music right now. So the moral of the story is, the more an eyewitness retrieves the memory, the further away from reality it travels. And this is why one of the most important tasks of the forensic psychologist is actually to teach police how to keep eyewitness memories free from contamination. One of the tasks of a forensic psychologist is to teach police to treat eyewitness memories the same way they treat physical evidence, like they would fingerprints or DNA evidence. So memories are an important part when we talk about eyewitnesses and how to control their memories. Another myth is that people cannot have a memory of something that never happened, if not from the original traumatic event, where did Jennifer's false memory arise? And many of you already guessed it. The origins of her memory of Ronald Cotton were from the photo identification and the other procedures the police used at the time, not from the actual event. We now know that it came from that. Her altered memory of Ronald Cotton, to her, felt more real to her. And here's the deal. You really cannot tell a false memory from a real memory. They both feel the same. And false memories are surprisingly easy to implant and manipulate into people. Let me show you an activity that I use them in the textbook, and I also use this one in class. Now, I'm going to read 15 words to you, and I'd like you to try to remember as many as you can. So here come the words. I'll give you just a few seconds to remember them, all right? Let me repeat them to you now. Steal, robber, jail, villain, bandit, criminal, rob, police, money, bad, burglar, crook, crime, gun, bank. Now count to 30. Or close enough. Do you remember hearing certain words? You may remember the very first word in the list, steal, and the last word in the list, bank. But you may also remember me saying the word thief. If you remember the word thief, which often happens when you list these lists of words, you're the victim of an implanted memory. Trust me, I didn't say the word thief. It wasn't in there. But what's interesting is that people they're sure they remember hearing the missing word, which is actually a false memory for an event that never occurred. Thief was related to all those words. And the way the human mind stores information, it activates it as a matter of consequence. So the false memory is another example of a source monitoring error. Simply, if you remember thief, you remember thinking about the missing word while reading the list or hearing the list. And then the mistake, the source of the memory, was your thoughts about it rather than it came from the list. So source monitoring errors are often the reason someone claims to have a memory for a crime they didn't commit, a false report, a false confession. So despite the belief that people don't confess to crimes they did not commit, many people have been convicted, prosecuted, and imprisoned because of false confessions. And surprisingly, it's been around since the early 1900s. It's not a new phenomenon. Hugo Musterberg was the father of forensic psychology, writing about it as early as 1908, and said that it's just a normal reaction to an emotional shock of arrest and interrogation. And what I find interesting is that why that kind of suggestion can alter our memories. So remember I told you that the memories are fragile and they can be easily reimagined. So suppose you witnessed a crime and the police ask you some questions later and they say, did you see a red VW Golf leave the scene? And you're thinking about it and going, yeah, no, VW Golf, did not see it. And you didn't really see one. But then the police ask you again. And you're sure you didn't see one. And maybe suddenly you're like, well, I think maybe there was, and I just forgot. And you start to question it because you're remembering something. While you're remembering it, the memory becomes unstable, fragile. And recalling the memory brings it back to that unstable state. And it's being rebuilt and reimagined. And in that moment, someone without meaning to, it could be police, interrogators, you never know, can slide something new in. And the memory gets restored and rebuilt. And the image of the red VW Golf the next day is in there. And the judge asks you, was there a red VW Golf there? And from your perspective, now it's a real memory. But what's so fascinating about this phenomenon is that red VW Golf that's now in your head is a vivid Technicolor image. You can see the sunlight reflecting off the paint. It feels real. And it's amazing how detailed these false memories become. Which is why when someone contradicts your memory and says that didn't really happen that way, we get angry. I mean, it feels like robbery. It feels like they're taking something from you. And that's what false memories feel like. We can't tell the difference. And that's why it's so hard to find out what actually is true. So the fourth myth was that victims of violent crime are never blamed for the crimes they suffer from. And as I composed this book, this was one of the biggest areas I was really upset to find that people like Jennifer Thompson was fortunate, that the police believed her story, that the jury did not blame her for being the victim of a violent crime. But tragically, victims are often blamed for being just that, for being a victim of a crime. So the question is, why do we blame victims for their suffering? Now, this question is actually the origin of a subfield of forensic psychology called forensic victimology. And some of you, the students, may be interested in looking into this as a possible career track. It's the examination of victims of crime to solve investigative and legal questions. We look at the patterns that these victims displayed, but remember, we're not blaming the victims for their crime. Studying victims is useful because it gives us a better understanding of the role that victims play in a crime. And it actually could provide more effective support for them and reduce victimization and even re-victimization. So we think the biggest factor that promotes victim blaming is something that you may be aware of, but we're going to give it a label. It's called the just world hypothesis. And the just world hypothesis is the idea that people deserve what happens to them. There's a really strong need to believe that we all deserve our outcomes and consequences. I mean, another way to think about it is this, that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. And as terrible as that sounds, people have a need for predictability, a common cognitive bias, and that individuals believe that the world operates in a fair and a predictable manner. Holding victims responsible for their misfortune is partly a way to avoid admitting that something just as unthinkable could happen to any one of us. So it's human nature to blame victims so that they continue to feel safe from themselves. And not everyone engages in this, but it is quite common, and it's terrible. In fact, in its more understated forms, people may not even realize they're doing it. Something as simple as hearing about a crime and thinking you'd be more careful had you been in the victim's shoes is just a mild form of victim blaming. I think it really helps people to feel like bad things will never happen to you and you can continue to feel safe. And what happened to that neighbor's child who was assaulted wouldn't happen to their own child because that other parent must have been doing something wrong. So victim blaming often brings to mind crimes like sexual assault, domestic violence, but interestingly enough, victim blaming occurs across the board in murders, burglaries, abduction. Whatever the crime, many people tend to default to victim blaming thoughts and behaviors as just a defense mechanism in the face of bad news. And so Jennifer was lucky that they believed her. Not too many victims are that lucky. Myth number 5. So one of the beliefs across many criminal justice systems is that long prison terms are the best way to prevent future crimes. After all, if you lock everyone up, there'll be no one left to commit crimes. But in July 1995, remember, the governor of North Carolina officially pardoned Ronald Cotton, and he was cleared of all charges and released from prison. Cotton served 10.5 years in prison. I mean, think about that. Think back to where you were and what you were doing in, say, the year 2010, a decade in prison. No amount of compensation can return those lost years. But why do we put people in prison is the question that forensic psychologists and criminologists and criminal justice people ask. Is it to protect society? Is it to rehabilitate? Or is it just to punish people? There's no right answer because a case can be made for every one of these options. We do know that prison changes people. It definitely alters their sense of the passage of time. It weakens their emotional life. It undermines their identity. And what psychological impact does prison have? Tremendous amount. Does it cause mental disorders? And what relationships do inmates have with their environments and themselves? And for inmates like Ronald Cotton, there's really 2 timelines when he entered prison. and they move at different speeds. The first is tied to their daily routine and is extremely repetitive. Prisoners can't choose when to eat, to bathe, to sleep, to awaken. Someone else has to make those decisions. And the second timeline relates to the external world, with which the prisoner is now completely out of sync as he's incarcerated or she's incarcerated. And it raises questions about desocialization and this isolation of incarceration. Working in the criminal justice and the prison systems is a strong influence that forensic psychologists can make. Now, we don't see supporting data that harsher prison terms cause less crime. Punishment via imprisonment does not seem to deter crime at all. And what would it take actually to increase the deterrence power of prisons? What would it take to make them be effective as a main deterrent? Well, to be successful, the punishment has to be swift, it has to be severe, and it has to be certain. The three things it is not in the majority of criminal justice systems. It's often slow, bogged down in court systems. It's often given as the least amount, the least severe punishment for the first offense. And far from certain, every criminal act will be punished. It is not the case. So I don't think that our criminal justice system is ready to turn prison systems as a form of deterrence. But fortunately, there are many other types of forms. Now, in the textbook, we talk more about the psychological effects of solitary confinement and the effects of prison in general and institutionalization and how that changes people. Fortunately, Ronald Cotton had the support and the rehabilitation programs that were available to him in prison, even though he was innocent. The final myth that I want to talk about today is the one that most people look at, and that's offender profiling. The key component of forensic psych is offender profiling is truly a myth. There are so many other components like interviewing children, working in prison populations, training police to work with eyewitnesses and victims of crime. In the case of Ronald Cotton, the real offender Bobby Poole, remember, was not caught by offender profiling. He was caught by DNA evidence. Most cases are solved by evidence, and only a small percentage of cases lend themselves to profiling. Many substantial numbers of offenders make for more accurate profiling, like shoplifting, etc. And fortunately, there are very few serial killers to get the law of large number working. But many of my students who want to become profilers, they want to become profilers. And, I can't blame you for wanting to become a profiler. It's shown in the entertainment media as glamorous and exciting, where the profiler comes from out of town or within a day and solves the crime by identifying the killer that the police spent years searching for. Or at the very least, that's often what we see in many television, movies, and other entertainment media. Offender profiling is just driven by popular interest and potential applications for more effective criminal justice system. And I'm not saying it doesn't work, but what I am saying is that unfortunately, with many of the older profiling techniques, there is a shroud of secrecy that protects the practice. And honestly, that's at odds with true scientific practice. So even those who claim to practice offender profiling state that it's both an art and a science. Fortunately, the field's becoming more scientific. And with a greater use of statistics and research methods, it's really getting better and better. Yet there's still a barrier for accepting profiling testimony in the courtroom. Some of it has to do with a lack of scientific studies to support many of profiling claims. And to make matters worse, the field continues to lack agreement about what is a required expertise, the ethics, the methods of profiling, and even certifications. So most entertainment media that you see, the movies out there, they depict profiling in a traditional method and used, especially the one criminal investigative analysis used by and designed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States, where they identify personality traits, behavioral patterns. But there are newer and more empirical approaches that honestly, they don't depend on the profiler for success, but the process. In the past, that's been the problem, is that all the techniques depended more on the person than the actual process. Imagine if your doctor was the only one that could practice medicine because he was the person who could practice it. So newer and more empirical profiling methods exist that seldom receive attention from the entertainment media. Let me just tell you about two of these. One is investigative psychology. Psychologist David Cantor developed investigative psychology, and his approach was unique because it draws on the principles of applied psychology, environmental psychology, and the goal was to infer characteristics of an offender based on their behavior during the crime, something we could all see and measure. It uses these complex interactions to help identify the person. Other promising approaches that I really think you'll find interesting, if you haven't heard about it, it's called crime linkage analysis. And it's the process of linking the known offender to one or more unsolved cases based on high levels of consistency, distinctiveness, and crime scene behavior across a series of offenses. And really, the field is moving from a clinical perspective to statistical analysis of police data, and crime linkage analysis reveals patterns in offender linking unsolved crimes to other behaviorally similar cases where the offender who was responsible may have been known. So what's interesting about this is these two techniques have actually been used, and we talk about a case where they've actually used these techniques to uncover the personality and the actual identity of famous graffiti artist Banksy. And you can read about that in the textbook as well. But why are there still confidence in these traditional forms of profiling? Mainly, it's the power of stories. We like to tell stories and use anecdotal evidence. Offender profiling stories in books and magazines and even some peer-reviewed journals often rely exclusively on a case study or just success stories to illustrate the successes. If you look deeper, you'll find that investigative psychology and crime linkage analysis are much better new techniques that offer much better outcomes than the traditional techniques, and you hardly ever hear about them. So look at where we've come today, and thank you for joining me on this journey. Sometimes we find that indeed the truth is stranger than fiction, and that's what I found in this journey writing this textbook. The case of Ronald Cotton and Jennifer Thompson illustrate many of the issues that forensic psychologists wrestle with, from preserving eyewitness memories, preventing false memories, and the importance of empirically trained police procedures. And I'd like to thank you all for joining me today, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions. Let me show you a little bit more about the book, and let's talk about the key points as we go through some of these questions.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was a great presentation. And I think it's really kind of unearthed, like just from the amount of questions that we've got, unearthed a lot of like people's kind of misconceptions about the field. And a lot of very valid questions about the state of our criminal justice system and why it hasn't changed and how we can go on with such a flawed system still. So yeah, I would love to pose some of these questions. Thank you everyone for submitting, and do keep them coming. We'll try and get through as many as we can. But yeah, just really quickly, if you'd like to find out a bit more about the book, please head to our website. You can see it there, macmillanihe.com. And also we're running a 20% off discount code for the book. It'll be running to the end of Feb. So you've got one there for the UK, and if you're tuning in from North America, there's another one there. So yeah, if you're interested, so you give that a go. But yeah, I think Tom will move on to the Q&A because we've got quite a few questions. Okay, I'm just gonna try and start up to the top. So one of them is, I think, related to the Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton case, which that was one of the first cases I think I read your manuscript, and it just blew me away. Like I couldn't believe that, you know, he'd spent that much time in jail due to, I don't know, the police like planting kind of false memories in Jennifer Thompson's mind, which is crazy. But yeah, one of the questions we've received is, why did it take them so long to use DNA evidence?
Good point. This was back in the 1980s. Thank you for that question. And DNA evidence was fairly new. In the United States, this was the time around the O.J. Simpson case when Ronald Cotton was first listening to the radio while he was out in the yard in the prison. And he heard about the O.J. Simpson case and how they used DNA evidence. And it was at its initial stage. Today, we realize they should have just started with the DNA evidence.
Mm.
Fortunately, there was still a fragment left that was viable that they could use. So it was a little too early. Today, it wouldn't have been a question, thank goodness. Thank you for that
Yeah.
question.
Another question that we've got is, how effective is the cognitive interview for improving reliability of eyewitness testimony?
Excellent point. Thank you for that question. The cognitive interview is a way that police and interrogators, investigators, can interview people using the methods of cognitive psychology to approach their memories. And essentially, instead of the standard police interview, which usually involves the police talking about 80% of the time and asking all the questions, and the witness only answering 20% of the time, the cognitive interview actually reverses that. This actually became this was a technique designed by a gentleman researcher known as Geiselman. And Geiselman had the problem was he was a young bachelor. His friends would come over at night and they would spend the night in his apartment, and they would normally forget things, and they would call him up and they would try to ask him, hey, did I leave that over at your apartment? And he got tired of trying to ask them where they left it. And suddenly he started asking them, because he was a psychologist, well, imagine you're back in my apartment. What do you see? And he developed this way of walking the witness and walking people through their memories, which is the cognitive interview. And basically, it's a way to preserve the memory by using the person's own memory and not a cognitive schema, which is a framework of knowledge that you already know. And it's an excellent way to pull memories out. And it works very well by focusing on the witness-centered interviewing and not police-centered. One last example, the problem with the standard interview is a police officer might say, for example, what type of gun was the robber using? What did he hold? Well, number one, perhaps that there was no gun. And number two, it might not have even been male, but yet the police officer may have implanted that. And this is what the cognitive interview doesn't do. It's an excellent technique. And we also cover this in textbook as well. Thank you for that question.
It's a great, yeah, it's a great question. Another question is, this is a student-focused question, but really interesting, really important, I think, is what advice would you give for a psychology graduate completing their final year project? They're about to do their essay for a university degree about eyewitness testimony, and the issues surrounding it. So any advice there?
Good luck on that, first and foremost. And second, when we talk about eyewitness testimony, if you're looking at that area, there's so many comparing and contrasting the standard police interview, the peace technique, which is used in the UK tremendously, and that has traveled throughout. It's an excellent technique to use. The cognitive interview can actually be broken down into 7 different components. And what area I would focus in on is they haven't really looked too much at personality differences in the cognitive interview. One of the areas that has a lot of controversy during the cognitive interview is to ask witnesses to work backwards or to imagine themselves, say, if they were a witness to a bank robbery, standing in the doorway of the bank, and imagine what you would have seen. Now, in a court of law, this is circumstantial evidence. This is not something that they actually perceive. This is using their imagination. Now, the cognitive interview suggests that this is a better way for the person to take another perspective. So even taking different perspectives or different components of the cognitive interview, they're still working on different parts. And I think some of the ideas that you can use are breaking it down to the different components, especially the taking different perspectives. Another component is asking the witness during the cognitive interview to imagine the events that took place and rewinding them, starting with the end, working backwards, and hoping that will create more memory cues. You could even look at the quality of the memory cues that are given to the eyewitness and seeing what quality of cues works, whether it's tactile or sensory cues or something related to something in their own, the witness's own background. So tremendous amount of research related to that in terms of the actual 7 steps. Good luck. I hope you do well.
Yeah, there we go. Some nuggets of wisdom from Tom himself. So another question is there any support for the just world belief, or is it just false cognitive bias?
There is research support for the just world belief, and it is a form of cognitive bias that we all use to some extent. And it's a good thing that the field of forensic victimology is growing, because for many decades, people were afraid that it was just going to devolve into this field of blaming victims for their crime. But yes, there's a lot of research that actually suggests that if you have subjects in a research situation observe a crime and then explain why that happened to them, you'll see examples of the just world hypothesis, where people will explain the reason it happened was because they were careless or because something about their personality caused them to be vulnerable. And there's very few examples of them being a victim where people say it was something totally random that happened in the environment. And this is the field for many of you. You're interested in psychology, and for all of us, if you ask questions like, why did this person do this and what caused this behavior, and you're trying to explain it, you're actually talking about psych. And in psychology, we use what's called attribution theory, where we try to explain the behaviors of others. And we always explain the behavior of others based on internal causes like their personality. And we never explain the behavior of others based on external causes like the sun was in their eyes and they couldn't see what's happening. And then this is called the fundamental attribution error, which is a mistake that we all make. And it's also related to this whole area of blaming the victim. So thank you for that question.
That's great. Another really interesting question is, what is the best way of going about getting forensic psychology experience that's relevant and useful?
As an undergraduate, many practicing forensic psychologists actually have a degree in clinical psychology, the broader area, and then they specialize in forensic psychology. Now, if I was an undergraduate, I would, of course, get my degree in psychology. But surprisingly enough, I would recommend a minor or at least many courses in statistical analysis, which may not have been something you expected. Understanding statistics and being able to read them would really benefit you if you look at some of the new techniques like crime linkage. As far as getting experience, many local police stations will offer internships, but I would recommend trying to work with, say, a prison psychologist, if that's possible, because prison psychologists and also forensic psychologists that work with children follow very specific protocols that have been designed and administered over many decades, and it's a great way to learn. In fact, I always tell my students, if you want to get a good internship, really push yourself to go out of your comfort zone. And if you like that internship, then you know you've chosen the right career. And if you hate that internship, then you know now, before you start that career, that's not something you want to do. Next. Thank you, Sophia.
No worries, that's a really good question. A question from someone who is very helpful with kind of reviewing the book. And they asked, what was something interesting or surprising that you learned during the process of researching for and writing your book?
Well, let's start with the book was about 3 times longer than it ended up being, which surprised me. But it truly was, and I don't mean this in any light way. It was a journey of discovery. There's so many chapters that started in one direction and ended up completely different than they started. I think that some of the areas that surprised me the most was the fact of interrogating people and how torture has absolutely no benefit. It literally does not work, and yet we still pursue torture. In fact, in the book, we talk about cases where people have used other techniques besides torture that are much more effective, that are based in the principles of social psychology. So torture was one area. The area of cyber stalking surprised me, and how very similar it is to real stalking. And so that was another area that very much surprised me. But the
Yeah,
main,
that was another one of our questions that I popped out, is what do you think is the difference between those two types of stalking?
well, in terms of the motivations, they're very, very similar. But in terms of differences, as you can imagine, cyber stalking has a global reach. And so it's very different in the terms of there's almost equal distribution of males and females that are stalked on the internet, cyber stalking, versus let's call it real world stalking, which is mostly predominantly men stalking women. But they both have some real world consequences, unfortunately, and tragically. And there are ways to look at it from a psychological standpoint, but they're very similar.
Yeah. So we've got another really interesting question. I'm often surprised by the accuracy of facial reconstruction images of witnesses to crimes. For example, the case of Peter Sutcliffe, where the photo fit, which the police seemed to ignore, was remarkably accurate. Could Tom talk a little about this, please?
Good point. And I am a skeptic, and I always train my students to be skeptics. That's my goal with the whole book as well. On the one side, we have people that are gullible. On the other side, we have people that are cynical. I want you to be right in the middle. Now, when they do talk about the facial reconstruction and the accuracy of it, you have to remember that you're only hearing about the successes. You're never hearing about all of the facial composite reconstructions that weren't successful. So that's part of it, is you're also hearing a little bit of a biased report. So there are times when it will be accurate, especially if someone has a very distinctive tattoo. For example, in many of the criminal databases used in many different countries, Interpol, FBI, and even in Australia as well, they keep track of the exact tattoos found on the offenders that they've arrested. And that's one way to identify them, especially with facial reconstruction. So my point is, while composite images are good, you're really only hearing about the successes. So I will look a little bit more deeply at that. Thank you, though.
Okay, so another question that we have is, given your point of the unreliability of human memories, bias, and emotions, should we discount forensic psychology and just rely upon the facts, for example, biometric evidence? What do you think, Tom?
Very interesting. I think part of it is that's one small area, and forensic psychology is moving towards those more biological, let's call them empirical measures, which I'm all for. But there's still a need for forensic psychology in so many different areas, like, for example, proper interviews of tragically abused children, domestic violence, even interviewing vulnerable suspects and vulnerable witnesses. Forensic psychology is also important for training police in proper formats of how to interview people, designing prison and evaluating prison rehabilitation programs. There's so many different areas besides eyewitnesses, but yes, I would trust a technological, empirical way more than a memory, because as soon as that memory is brought up, it starts to change and alter, and it can be extremely fragile.
Yeah. So a good question here related to kind of interviewing vulnerable witnesses. What is your best advice in relation to interviewing vulnerable witnesses in terms of research and practice direction?
Yep. Thank you for that question. We spend a lot of time in the text talking about this whole issue, and there's a range of vulnerable witnesses, from people that are older that may have difficulty with perceptual issues like hearing or vision, to people on the autistic spectrum as well. And some of the importance there is to set the environment. For example, if we were working with someone that was on the autism spectrum, the first thing we would want to do is educate police interviewers with this eyewitness of how to set up the environment, to avoid distractions, for especially younger persons on the autism spectrum, to allow them to bring in, say, fidget toys to keep them calm and comfortable. And also to be careful of the words that they use when they say, oh, for example, take a chair. Some individuals literally will take the chair. So you have to be careful about the speed, the pace, and what your expectations are. But the thing that surprised me was many of people that are on the autism spectrum are actually better witnesses than your layperson. They see the details, they pay attention to important parts of the situation in the environment. So they're definitely worth interviewing. And in the past, police wouldn't waste their time interviewing these people, and they're often a surprisingly excellent witness when handled correctly. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great question. Yeah, as you said, you definitely discuss that in depth in the book. Super interesting. So I think we have time for maybe another 4 questions. So we've got a good one here. Is it reliable when children become eyewitnesses? I know we have a dedicated chapter to this, and it's a very interesting topic.
Thank you for this question. This is often another misconception. For decades, many criminal justice systems thought that children do not make good witnesses. And one, they were of course worried about the psychological sway of an innocent child on the witness stand and how it would affect the jury. But secondly, they thought that their cognitive development wasn't strong enough and they couldn't be interviewed. And it turns out that in many ways, children are better witnesses than adults. And I'll give you an example. Adults have what are known as cognitive schemas. These are framework of knowledge for how the world works. And we make more complicated frameworks of knowledge. For example, how to start a computer or order food in an expensive restaurant. Children don't have these cognitive schemas. And so when they see two people interacting, and you and I may say they're in an argument or a fight, a child may just look at what they're doing and interpret the exact behaviors without any preconceptions or biases. So they can. But fortunately, we have new techniques for interviewing these children, and we can actually capitalize on their unique abilities. I mean, perceptually, children have better eyesight and vision than us. Next.
Yeah, really interesting. Do any forensic psychologists work towards reducing incarceration as a method of punishment?
Definitely. I mean, one of the key components is, from a psychological standpoint, we know that many components of incarceration just do not reduce crime as a deterrence. So many forensic psychologists work as prison psychologists, and there are so many different rehabilitation programs that work on things like a strength-based model. Some work on a religious or a faith-based model. Some are cognitive interventions. And there's all types of approaches. I personally like the ones where they have people that are incarcerated working to rehabilitate animals for guide dogs, etc., and how that works to not only deter them, but give them a skill for when they get out and reinforce their self-esteem instead of the punishment, which we know doesn't work.
So another question is, are there any other case studies that you would recommend to go and research before going to university? Now, I know the book is packed full of case studies. One of them, the Ronald Cotton and Jennifer Thompson one, that you discussed in your presentation, but are there any in particular, or any kind of recent case studies, do you think, that people should take note of?
I think, if I think about the case studies, there are many that look at, I would say, especially in America, we look at the insanity defense. And Andrea Yates is a great example of that, where she had drowned her own children. And the question was, can you use insanity as a defense? And Also, there have been many cases that we talk about which are somnambulistic homicide, which is really sleepwalking homicide. The cases where can you blame someone for what they did that is not under their actual control? Many cases of ritualistic abuse and satanic abuse, the McMartin preschool, Charles Whitman and the science of free will. There's so many out there. I think about cases where people have been cajoled into what we call death by texting, where they've been pushed forward to commit suicide via text messages by others. And is that really, or could you be legally held responsible for that? There's so many new ones out there. In fact, what is really enjoyable about this is that in the instructor's guide that I put together a whole list of podcast resources because everything is changing so quickly. It's a truly dynamic field. But I think some of the main areas are legal responsibility. That is one of the areas to look at. There's so many areas in that. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, really good question. And yeah, Tom just kind of pointed together, he's put compiled like further resources on this subject that's paired with the book, so you can access that via our website. It's got a companion website to the book as well for students and for lecturers. They just want some kind of extra resources to help them study. I think we'll have one final question, and thank you everyone for submitting. I'm sorry we can't get through all of them, but yeah, thank you so much. So the last question is, how can we interview children victims of sexual abuse in order to get accurate information? Do you think we need to ask specific questions?
This is a good question that they've been asking for a long time when we talk about this area. Interviewing children is challenging on so many different levels. One of the areas that we look at when we interview children is the NICAD protocol, which is a national protocol for interviewing children. In fact, in Europe, they've actually created something called the barn house, which means the child's house, where children can be interviewed in a safe environment. And I think it's amazing, and it works very, very well. Well, you have a child psychologist, a forensic psychologist, and the parent, and they are there and they are trained to preserve the child's memory, though, in a safe environment. And children can be interviewed. And examples I would look up if you're really interested in is the barn house. And this technique is used very, very well. But I have to warn you, as rewarding as it is to work with children, there is a high level of burnout and there is problems. We talk about this in the book, is that there's so great a deal of suffering from the same compassion fatigue working with these children. So it takes a very strong and a very special person to be able to do this. And many of you out there can, and it's very rewarding, but there are very specific protocols, step by step, that they have worked out over the decades for getting excellent interview information while still protecting the child of abuse. Thank you for that question. That was a really good one to end on.
Yeah, it's good to know that there are guidelines and frameworks out there for tackling kind of tough topics like this. Yeah, everyone, thank you so much for your questions. And yeah, just to a few kind of people have been writing to just ask if this is going to go on YouTube, and yes, it will be. It'll be on Macmillan International Higher Education's YouTube channel, so you can watch it back, and everyone can access it. And yeah, thank you so much. Please take note of the discount code there if you would like to purchase a copy of the book. It's fascinating, so many great cases in there, really good selection of topics. So I hope that instructors and students both find it very useful and interesting. So yeah, thank you so much. And Tom, do you want to say final words?
Yeah, let me just one thing I wanted to point out to all of you, the instructors and students alike, writing this book was definitely a voyage of discovery, but I want to invite students and instructors alike. One of my goals is to create a community of learners and combining the efforts of students and instructors and making kind of a cross-cultural connections. I would love to be able to work with students from other countries as well. I remember that crime is global, and so are the psychological explanations and principles behind it. And, I just want to thank Luke Block and Sophia Ali for supporting me in this. And it was Luke's original vision that got me into this, and Sophia's enduring patience. And finally, all of the reviewers out there, I so appreciate your generous time that you gave me and your insights as well. They were extremely valuable, and thank you so much.
Yes, thank you everyone, and thank you everyone who's tuned in and attended, and for all your questions and for all your support. And yeah, I hope you all have lovely evenings, days. It's just started snowing quite a bit here in London actually. So yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.